So we're going to start things quite broad, warm things up with some quick fire questions. So to everyone on the panel, jump in with your answers. We will kick off with, so when did you realise that risk needed to be closer to strategy rather than just sitting alongside it?
I'll jump in. I think I realised that in my very first risk role. I started my career at Nomura in operations and worked in middle office, so I was very closely aligned to the global markets front office, helping them. And then I moved into operations risk and control, and I understood quite quickly that you had to be able to embed risk in decision making and be very outcome focused. It's not appropriate just to lay on risk after the fact. You need to really put it at the heart of decision making and make it outcome focused.
Yeah, I think from my side, so I most of my career has been in financial services. I spent a long time in Barclays, for example, in a range of risk and risk adjacent roles. However, when I went to Save the Children, I played a role in helping to define their 15-year vision and associated 3 to 5 year strategy and plan alongside it. And that was one of the first times I really had the luxury, because I oversaw the risk function as well, as setting out the strategy, the luxury of co-creating strategy with risk in mind, and then the risk agenda with strategy in mind. And I just realized how much more integrated and effective and real life and embedded the conversations were when you did that from the get-go.
That's great. Aidan, anything to add?
No, I mean, I started back in the days of Basel I and Basel II, so market risk and credit risk, where you had to have a portfolio view. So it's kind of always been embedded there. But I think more recently, it's much more, getting a holistic view on things has become much more important into the fore.
Okay, great. And what does strategic ERM actually look like in practice then?
Look, we all know the ISO 31000 definition, right? Risk is the impact on your strategic objectives, right? The possibility that things might go wrong with your strategy. Strategy is where do we want to get to and how are we going to get there? By when? What does good look like? What does success look like for us? And risk is nothing more and nothing less than the potential for that to be disrupted. And if you think about the most basic SWOT analysis, right? That most basic engine of strategy: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Opportunities are upside risks. Threats are downside risks. So in the very definition and the very way we go about devising strategy is an acknowledgement of the potential for risk. So strategic ERM to me is when everything in your risk agenda is done cognizant of the strategy, the goals, the purpose of the organization, where it's trying to get to, and risk is a clear-eyed view of what could happen to disrupt the achievement of those goals.
I think Jennifer's captured it perfectly. I think in all organizations, increasingly more recently with sort of developments, things like AI, resilience, regulations, etc., things like that, I think really where risk impact strategy is not just being embedded in committees and in reporting, but risk having a seat at the table, being the CRO, having the power to drive strategy and understand where the business is going and how risk can help in that.
Yeah, I think for me it's simple. It's joining the dots. When you have a risk framework and a risk function that is able to join the dots and look around corners, then you have a seat at the table when you're talking about strategy. So that's important for me.
Okay. Final warm-up question then. Where would you say that the friction might come from?
I can take this one from. I think for me, friction comes where you've got a very staid and very defined approach to risk management. You have a risk management and a risk monitoring plan that is, we must do this, and that doesn't allow for any space for thematic reviews, for strategic reviews, but also to go out there and talk to people and understand the business. Simple as that.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to get focused on the admin, isn't it? And obviously it's one of the reasons why we we like platforms like RiskSmart. If you're spending too much of your time as a CRO or in the risk function going, did you fill in your RCSA? I'm still waiting for that thing from you. Filling in forms, backward looking, getting bogged down in the weeds, then that's a little, then what you're not doing is having a discussion with your colleagues about what they're worried about right now, what could come next around the corner, what's the thing that's keeping them awake at night, and you inadvertently then inject friction into what should be, a really important conversation.
I think for most firms, it's not a tooling problem or a framework issue. It's just more bringing that framework, tooling, data and information, leading it to giving an insight as opposed to just being a standalone process or procedure itself.